Ukrainians and Russians began a desperate battle for a village where no more than 1,000 people lived before the war. Their rifles fired at each other from the houses or from the forests. The men who moved into the area were watched by drones or by artillery, which hunted them down until only corpses were left. Gradually, the battle escalated to a point where Krynk became a graveyard of men and war machines. In a valley of fire surrounded by rivers of death and swamps of shadows, the waters of the Dnipro flowed along the banks toward the sea, unconcerned with the lives being taken on the surface. The current absorbed the corpses in shelling with a phlegmatic tone. The water splashed with the explosions or turned red with blood. But the Dnipro continued on its way. The river took the opportunity to hide the corpses of many men, so that the next ones would not be frightened when facing the Dnipro port, purgatory. On Earth, the apocalypse was called Krynk, where so many were heading, for battles incomprehensible to the minds of civilians and soldiers, but somehow rational in the heads of their leaders. Krynk was a city with less than 1,000 inhabitants. Before it was completely evacuated because of the war and the flooding caused by the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam by Russia, this tiny place was transformed. It would become the purgatory for many men speaking Russian or Ukrainian, and occasionally a language that was not native to the region. The local history could be summed up by the powerful advance of the Russians in 2022, taking control of Kherson and both banks of the Dnipro, until the Ukrainian counteroffensive drove out the invaders later that same year, turning the banks into a crucial point for unresolved battles. During the next 2 years, both armies tried to cross the river and establish their bases on the other side. But drones and artillery took care of destroying boats and sending a morbid feast to the fish. Those who managed to cross were, at best, lucky if their bodies were recovered by the enemy to be exchanged later. That's how it was for a long time, with Ukraine trying to set up bases on the other side. One of them was at the Antonovsk Bridge. The area around the structure was one of the most contested. No matter the riverbank, the Russian TOS-1S bombarded the surrounding houses where the Ukrainians tried to take cover. Before crossing the river, the Air Force deployed drones to observe and collect coordinates. After programming their bombs, they were loaded onto Su-34s which flew freely over the region. Each one fell on the houses, destroying everything and opening craters that reached even the basements where the soldiers tried to hide. Among so many attempts to establish a bridgehead on the other side of the river, Ukraine came up with a plan with the first attacks to liberate Oleshki. The idea was to establish a bridgehead at the location, and it has already begun. With the attacks against the UROCM video surveillance system and the Poly-21 electronic warfare system, the communication towers became easy targets to reduce contact between enemy troops. Later, the Russian drone operators were found on top of buildings while piloting the equipment. The kamikazes flew toward them, descending faster than the men could hide and blowing up the buildings. The centesimal term, the 26th Territorial Defense Brigade, is still under discussion. Ukraine targeted Russian vehicles on the city streets, aiming to stop the movement of drone operators and spotters. The Lelika 100 reconnaissance drone took off to observe the streets and highways leading to the city. He adjusted fire against the D-30 cannons which the Russians used to torment the Ukrainians. On the other bank, not so much. Those artillery pieces exploded. The 61st Russian Naval Infantry Brigade has already put other equipment into action. The Kremlin soldiers tried to set up an M-STA-B howitzer to hit their opponents almost 30 kilometers away, but they were quickly spotted by the same drone, which guided the HIMARS to strike the equipment and the crew, resulting in permanent casualties. The combination of an observation drone with HIMARS was a powerful tool to fill the Russians with fear and try to teach them a lesson. Groups of mobilized soldiers were found training in Kherson, where they were supposed to be part of a reserve for possible reinforcements in the region. The arrival of the missile greatly hastened the sending of letters and pensions to their families in yet another tragic elimination of the youth. In the war, one of the objectives was to maintain as many attacks as possible against the Russians to clear the way for the bridgehead to be formed, the internal one. But the kamikaze drones put an end to the metal monster, proving once again that even the best tanks had a fierce predator on the battlefield. Still confident from having control over the city, the Russians kept their drone pilots on top of the buildings so they could thoroughly scan the entire area. One of them sensed it from the wind itself and ran desperately to escape death when he saw it flying toward him. He knew the odds, the speed and the accuracy, and he understood them well. When the explosion threw him, his comrades risked themselves to recover the man, trying to save him. There seemed to be little evidence that the Ukrainians had actually managed to establish a bridgehead in Olishch. Destruction the Russians initially denied, but they themselves showed it when they sent their bombs against the houses closest to the river. The successive explosions on both banks showed the Kremlin troops concern about the Ukrainian advance, but the fury of the bombings prevented any progress around there. There was, however, another point where Kiev would place its men. Krynk was not yet a purgatory on Earth, a preview of the apocalypse or anything like that, at least in October 2023. There were many houses still standing, and the Russians used cars to get around. They started to become targets for the Ukrainians, who put the enemies on alert with the successive explosions. There were few ways to reach Krynk, among them the rivers, the dark swamps, or the marked road that passed through the Valley of Fire watched by Russian artillery. The Ukrainians needed many attempts, in so many of which the soldiers were caught by the enemies, while they tried to cross the rivers parallel to the Dnipro, such as the Krynky River. Sometimes, a boat managed to make the journey and drop the soldiers near the swampy areas, but Russian drones noticed the movements. Even at night, these men were illuminated by the explosions that tore through their bodies. The pressure was too much for the soldiers from Kiev. The 37th and 38th Brigades, separate Marine units, had the mission of getting their soldiers into the village. Drones littered the path with grenades, splashing water and fragments near the boats. The soldiers sped up their vessels, trying to escape the pursuit. They were seen wherever they went, with grenades always coming down as a threat that forced them to change course and be surrounded by the bursts. What a grenade missed, and first-person view corrected, hitting the Ukrainians directly. The cameras in the sky searched for incursions to bomb around the rivers, whose waters mixed with the Dnipro and led to Krynk. Little by little, however, the boats gradually approached the village, passing through the Krynky River and entering the Krynky River. It was the first sigh of relief, but not the end of the mission. Reaching the edge of their objective was only part of the tense moments when the soldiers' lives were at risk. Detected while trying to use the road and move quickly, the Ukrainians passed by destroyed Russian armored vehicles and continued under bombardment, feeling the pressure of the air and the shrapnel. When the bombs exploded nearby, their feet pushed them along the path, breathing in the heavy air of the Valley of Fire. On a path with almost no cover, it was nearly impossible to escape. The drones found every Ukrainian hiding in the woods, pointing to the spot with death's cadaverous finger, and the artillery tried to finish the job, weakening what it couldn't kill. When the Ukrainians lay down to protect themselves, the drones dropped grenades on the small groups. Despair and courage were what kept the men still united and trying to cross that smoky valley. Those who survived the crossing of hell moved stealthily between the houses, carrying their rifles and fearing an ambush. At any moment, a shot could come from the windows. The men entered the abandoned buildings and breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to have a roof over their heads. Russia made sure to correct that, starting its bombardments to ensure that the enemy's rest never lasted long. The Ukrainians kept approaching the houses and were spotted by drones. Russian artillery continued the bombardment over Krynk. The TOS-1S created a storm of thermobaric munitions over the houses. Fire became a constant, both at night and during the day. The Ukrainians heard non-stop explosions. The bombs roared through the village, consuming the houses. The lives of the soldiers were taken by the violence. Under the rubble or torn apart by the explosions, the bodies began to pile up. The Russian troops were sent into the forest. Next to the village, the Marines of the 80th 10th Naval Infantry Brigade set up their mortar teams to assemble their weapons. They reloaded quickly, firing the shells at the houses which were still withstanding the artillery punishment. From the forest, they watched the fire search for Ukrainian flesh, listening to the explosions that drowned out the screams and prayers of the men under attack. The marches at nightfall were not much help to the soldiers of Kyiv. The men of the territorial defense battalions faced the terror of the night, aware that they could be watched as they moved through the shadowy swamps. What could have been protection became an even greater fear. When the darkness was broken, it was because fire was coming, which only increased a man's despair in the face of his greatest fears. Grenades falling were a countdown to the end of life. The brigades from Kyiv kept sending the men. They ran through the village, looking for a suitable house to take cover in, desperately searching for one that had a basement. The Russians watched and prepared their mechanisms of death to turn the shelters into tombs for those the Russians had targeted. The Ukrainian persistence did not just leave corpses in Crimea. The men started gathering in the houses, becoming an increasing threat to the Russians. These groups found basements and structures still standing to establish themselves inside the houses. Their rifles began firing at the enemies in the direction of the forest. The Russian Marines quickly sent reinforcements to keep the Ukrainians pinned in that position and eliminate them quickly. The Kremlin's men fired from the scant cover. The space between the trees made it easier for the Ukrainians to aim, which caused the Marines to move quickly. The men started getting wounded and were forced to retreat and wait for more reinforcements for a more direct fight. This retreat was not a relief for the Ukrainians. A kamikaze drone visited them the next morning, starting the day with a succession of macabre blows. The bombs flooded Krynk with violence. Sometimes there were so many that it seemed to make the ground come alive, moving as it was torn apart into rocks and rubble that flew along with the smoke. The thermobaric ammunition fell, sucking up oxygen for mere moments for the combustion of the aerosol, which spread heat and the pressure wave everywhere. The name of the TOS-1 wasn't translated as scorching sun for nothing. The succession of projectiles was a quick demonstration of destruction. The Russian troops of the 810th kept moving forward to reinforce some of the positions since the Ukrainians insisted on staying alive. Everyone ducked quickly when the shots went over their heads. The shots were coming from the forest, most likely from a machine gun. Frozen, the men tried to communicate and gradually discovered that it was an allied position, and the friendly fire almost wiped everyone out. They started to laugh, nervous because they were still alive. It could have been a disaster. The Ukrainians saw that relief from the Marines still lying down, and their drones decided to wipe the smiles off the Russians' faces. The grenades rained down on the men pinned down by their own comrades, keeping them as mere trap targets to be killed by the enemies. An entire squad wiped out by a basic communication error. Part of this happened because of the Russian insistence on denying that the Ukrainians were inside Krynk. This went on for a long time, and even when the enemies showed videos with the flags, they claimed it was a lie, part of the information war that even affected the lives of the soldiers. It was a matter of strategy and pride to end the Ukrainian presence on that bank of the Dnipro. The Ukrainians couldn't bring heavy machinery, but the Russians could. The T-72s were moved in to bombard the village. Kyiv's drone detected them. When they stopped to begin their work, grenades rained down in succession on the armor until they slid off. The Ukrainian Marines threw everything they had at those machines, which came one after another against Krynk, filling the armored vehicles with smoke and blasting through their armor. The crews turned back with both vehicles still under fire, but one of them couldn't withstand the pressure, dying right in front of the pilot's controls. The Marines fled quickly, taking cover until the drone approached and put an end to any chance of recovery. The scourge that the Russians inflicted on the Ukrainians was too varied to be stopped by just that. Helicopters appeared to fire their rockets, taking advantage of the lack of anti-aircraft defenses and the difficulty of transporting heavier weapons to Krynk. Then, the TOS-1s continued to scourge the men between the houses, unleashing death at any time. The drones found the weapon during the night and sent a present a little bigger than a simple grenade. It took more than one hit, but the TOS-1 detonated like any weapon in that war, falling to the drone hunt. The Russian squads kept trying to enter the city, using the cover of artillery or armored vehicles. From time to time, the vehicles moved into Krynk and some were violently intercepted. Still on the way, stopping their advance, the following ones continued with their cannons, firing at the houses, hoping to hit some Ukrainian or at least allow the Marines to advance so they could start close combat. Some were hit while trying to return to their positions. Others became targets for Ukrainian drone pilots or artillery from the other side of the river, starting to become unprecedented casualties, with grandchildren on the battlefield and leaving the soldiers alone. In Krynk, even tanks hidden in the middle of the forest were burned by kamikaze drones, descending between the trees and lighting up the metal with fire. Without cover, the Marines began to walk through Krynk at dawn, trying to find a base. They were still confused about which direction to go when the kamikaze caught their scent and began the chase. The explosion engulfed and suffocated the last members of the squad, with a few still managing to escape. The Russian Marine, hit by the 37th Ukrainian Brigade, staggered down Krynk Street, trying to find shelter, leaving behind the bodies of his comrades. He hid under the rubble, trying to breathe. He wondered who would come first, help or enemy fire. But that was the village of shadows and fire, which blinded hope and burned. Obviously, destruction arrived before the Russians had a preference for attacking at the beginning or end of the night. Darkness was terror in Krynk, even for the attackers, supported by artillery and armored vehicles. The Valley of Fire and the shadowy swamps were full of danger and terror. The shells from the Ukrainian mortars made their way between the tree trunks, falling on any squad that dared to fire even a single shot at the Ukrainians. Among the dead and wounded, those still standing tried to help, but a decision was made and sparks flew in the night of the dark forest. After that, fewer men than before returned to their positions. The 810th tried to carry more Russian Marines on their tanks for a direct raid into the houses of Krynk. The armored vehicles moved along the road, with their turrets turning to aim at the Russians. It exploded before any shots were fired, ending up abandoned next to the forest from which it had come, and right in front of the bodies of Marines killed days earlier. The second one approached slowly, passing by the wrecks of other vehicles and men. The Marines above them moved nervously, anticipating the tough fight ahead. Their ears were filled with the roar of the cannon firing, and the response engulfed the armored vehicle. In a sphere of flames, it continued on its path, leaving men falling, wounded on the road, and others dead or stunned around it. It stopped by the forest, then retreated with smoke still rising from its armor. Thus, what were once only bodies of Ukrainians in Krynk became diversified with Russian corpses and armored vehicles. The war, a war of attrition, reached the fishermen's village, forever changing the landscape. The village would never be the same again. Governments would claim victories or defeats in Krynk, but the only real winner in the attrition between the troops was the grief in the hearts of their relatives.